Meeting in progress. And we are clerk's laptop, sound check. Clerk's laptop, sound check. ENCS, sound check 1, 12:56 p.m. Presenter's laptop, sound check 1. Presenter's laptop, ENCS, June 3rd, sound check 1, 12:56 p.m. And we are back. Councillor Nan, we are now ready.
Excellent. Thank you. Good afternoon, committee colleagues, staff, and the viewing public. I'd like to call the Emergency Community Services Committee meeting of June 3rd, 2021 to order. Members of the public are advised that committee meetings are webcast live by the City of Hamilton and temporarily archived on the city's website. Other individuals and media may also be audibly or visibly recording this meeting, and all electronic devices are to be switched to a non-audible function during committee meetings. Members are reminded that we are adhering to the 5-minute time limit, which will be adhered to in this meeting. You can always submit another request to speak if you require more time or have more comments to make. I'll commence with roll call at this point. Please indicate your presence when I call your name. Councillor Clark?
I'm here.
Thank you. Councillor Jackson?
Chair Nan, present.
Thank you. Councillor Marula? I think he just stepped away for a minute. He might be joining us soon. And Councillor Pauls?
Good afternoon, Chair.
Good afternoon. Madam Clerk, are there any changes to the agenda? Good afternoon, Councillor Marula.
No, Madam Chair, there are no changes to the agenda, but the presentation for item 8.1, Adaptation and Transformation Update 3, HSC 20020, has been published and is available on eScribe and the city's website.
Excellent. Thank you for that. May I please have a mover and seconder to approve the agenda as presented? Moved by Councillor Paul, seconded by Councillor Clark. Any discussion on the agenda as presented? Seeing none, we'll move to an electronic vote.
Bear with me for 1 second while I call up the vote. Just a second. Bear with me for a moment. All right, there you are. Councillor Merlin Jackson, Councillor Jackson, there we are. The vote is closed, and it is unanimous.
Thank you.
Carries.
Moving on to item 3. Any declarations of interest, colleagues? Seeing none, we'll move along to approval of the minutes of our previous meeting on May 6th. May I please have a mover and seconder to approve the minutes? Moved by Councillor Marula, seconded by Councillor Jackson. Any discussion on the minutes?
Councillor Nan and Councillor Clark. Councillor Clark has a thumbs up. Councillor Nan, just waiting for your vote. You've lost your camera. There you are.
Okay, there we go.
Okay, sorry about that. Councillor Nan, we're just waiting for you to vote on the minutes.
No problem. I think my internet just went down for a moment there, and I'm definitely in favor.
Okay, great. So that vote is closed, and it carries 5-0.
Thank you. Moving on to item 7, or consent items. 7.1 is the Hamilton Veterans Committee minutes of March 23rd, 2021. There was a no quorum report. May I please have a mover and seconder to receive the report? Moved by Councillor Jackson, seconded by Councillor Pauls.
And the vote is closed, and it carries unanimously.
Thank you. Staff presentations, item 8.1, Adaptation and Transformation Update number 3. I'd like to call on Edward John, our Director of Housing Services, to give the presentation. Ed, if you could please turn on your camera and microphone and share your screen when you're ready. And the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon. And Edward John, Director of Housing Services. Bear with me one moment just as I bring up our presentation. Hopefully that is now shown for the committee and the watching public.
It's coming in. Yep.
Perfect. I do apologize. I have a tickle in my throat, so to avoid coughing directly down my microphone, I may be doing a little bit of quick movement, but if there's any issues with hearing me, please make it known and I will do my best to accommodate. Thank you and good afternoon. So today I'm pleased to take you through the third update in the series of reports we have presented to this committee on adaptation and transformation for people experiencing homelessness. I first want to thank my staff who have worked tirelessly throughout the pandemic, demonstrating incredible resilience and creativity, and similarly, the amazing responses from our community partners who have collectively helped inform the direction and responses discussed today. With respect to this report, this is both an update on our pandemic responses, as well as, more importantly, it seeks to support the ongoing interventions we are looking to fund to transition our actions from largely emergency responses to a more stable and sustainable evidence-led housing system. In terms of a summary of where we are, we presented in June 2020 this framework that guided our initial COVID-19 response. As you will all recall, we worked quickly at the onset of the pandemic to ensure considered and appropriate responses were in place to support those experiencing homelessness. Many of those immediate and midterm approaches have been implemented, including but not limited to the creation of safe distanced accommodations, isolation spaces, and funding for drop-in support facilities. In our midterm response, we have now been able to successfully transition away from the use of First Ontario Centre as a surge shelter, and will this month transition away from the use of Bonetto Rec Centre as an isolation space, allowing for this to return to operation in line with the opening up of recreation facilities identified in the provincial framework. Currently, we've moved to implementing remaining elements while planning for long-term actions outlined in this report. The recommendations build on these long-term actions, outlining a transition to a more responsive, resilient, sustainable, and housing-focused homeless serving system, effectively integrated into the broader social safety net. We recognize that transition in and by itself, given the significant emergency measures put in place, will take time and require flexible and responsive interventions as we continue to learn more about the pandemic and, most importantly, the needs of those in the system. While this has been an incredibly challenging year, we have secured a number of successes, as well as continue to learn and apply evidence-led responses to the system. Prior to the pandemic, housing placement targets, as shown in this slide, were negotiated with providers with much higher expectations in 2021 based on additional investments through this 2019 call for applications into housing with support interventions. These additional investments allowed us to not only keep pace with previous years, but exceed previous years' placement numbers, notwithstanding that the actual intended targets were projected to be far higher. These significantly higher targets were rejected in order to meet the requirement of ending chronic homelessness in Hamilton by 2025, and were resourced accordingly based on available funding. As you can imagine, as we've all experienced, the pandemic significantly impacted the ability of our community partners to achieve these greater targets, both directly as supply and access to units were challenged, and indirectly as many partners had to redeploy staff from these programs to assist with emergency measures implemented. So we did house more people, which is fantastic, but why do we have so many people staying longer in the system? Well, our outflow, while improving, is still not high enough to balance the total number of people already in the system, as well as new flow on top of that. We are on the cusp of moving forward with integrated programs through enhanced funding as of April 1st, 2020. However, this implementation and outcomes were impacted through COVID-19. The challenge for the system, therefore, is to encourage the ability to realign the actions and interventions necessary to deliver these pre-pandemic targets. And not to editorialize too much, but in many ways this pandemic has heightened the awareness that ending chronic homelessness is the most effective way to ensure future resiliency against similar pandemics. And for those interested in specific numbers, and unable to make it from this slide, I can confirm that permanent housing placements through April 1st, 2020 to March 31st, 2021, 319 households were housed, 741 individuals represented. In order to create the most appropriate response, we needed to understand the pressures that were generated in the system as a result of the pandemic. As we look at the systems level data and information, we're also looking more closely at demographic breakdowns to inform our detailed response to better understand unique needs and experiences of women, youth, families, and Indigenous populations to ensure that our response isn't one size fits all and meets the needs of specific populations. What we are seeing is continued occupancy pressures, notwithstanding that the number of available beds within the system has increased by over 50% through the pandemic. As this slide highlights, the reason when we looked at the data was that it was length of stay and not significant increases in unique users that was the primary driver. Limitations in both diversion and outflow into housing was ballooning our numbers within the shelter beds. The push by housing services to ensure through much of the pandemic there was space available clearly was the most appropriate emergency response. But as we now transition from an emergency response to more sustainable actions, a focused return to diversion and outflow is required, and it is through the recommendations that we believe this will be best achieved. In terms of some of the highlights of this slide, certainly in 2020, Hamilton's emergency shelter saw an 18% increase in length of stay. This was coupled with only a 7% decrease in unique individuals served in 2020. So once again, reinforcing that it's not the numbers in the system, but the length of stay that they are maintaining in those beds. As such, through the ongoing impacts of COVID-19, we'll continue to require flexibility to meet the needs of individuals accessing services, including through prevention and housing programs. And the recommendations recognize the need for continued flexibility over a period of 1 to 2 years to support the transition from COVID pandemic response. So the plan before you today recognizes the current need identified in the community and projects transition measures to move away from our reliance on emergency interventions. There is a demonstrated need in the community to have the flexibility to maintain these responses created between March 31st, 2022, in order to continue to respond to immediate and ongoing pressures during COVID-19. These measures are not meant to be permanent and all won't necessarily go to the end dates listed. However, this gives us that flexibility to transition our responses in alignment with the outcomes and strategies within Hamilton Housing and Homelessness Action Plan. Of most note, in terms of those emergency responses we are looking to support us through our transition period, is the operation of 378 Main Street East, as known as Cathedral's Boys School, as a temporary surge shelter for men, and this is to go no later than December 31st, 2021. The continued rental of hotel rooms for expanded temporary housing and additional supports. The continued operation of COVID-19 isolation services for people experiencing homelessness, and the continued enhanced drop-in services provided in order to deal with many of the impacts as a result of COVID-19. The plan presented is based on responding to an overall lack of outflow during COVID-19 and a recognition that the transition plan will take time. The item listed in recommendation B to E, essentially shelter adaptions and housing allowances, speak to the transition away from a reliance on hotel usage and instead towards a more sustainable emergency shelter and permanent housing solution, required both to meet the immediate and long-term needs. During this transition, it's important that we continue to evaluate and assess the impact and effectiveness of these interventions, which includes expanded drop-in services, in order to assess long-term strategic alignment and contributions to our systems-level outcomes. In order to really create momentum for outflow, we are recommended, among other important interventions, the immediate investment in housing allowances and connection of these allowances to ICM and rapid rehousing programs. The increased length of stay continues to be a primary driver of pressures in the emergency system. As such, we want to ensure that there's an appropriate focus on homelessness prevention and permanent housing solutions. In doing so, we take stock of the need for a meaningful equity approach. We continue to meet with sector tables moving forward and build on mechanisms for meaningful engagement of people with living and lived experience in processes that inform our transitional planning actions. We also acknowledge the systemic overrepresentation of Indigenous persons experiencing homelessness and the continued need to prioritize consistent approaches that acknowledge autonomy and self-determination as key pillars of engagement alongside Hamilton's urban Indigenous community. through our work alongside the Coalition of Hamilton Indigenous Leadership, CHIL. CHIL is the Indigenous community entity, remains a critical partner in our collective work of reducing homelessness. Similarly, we recognize the unique needs of women, trans, and non-binary individuals experiencing homelessness and work towards interventions and address gaps in access. Just quickly taking you through the slide, in terms of the mentioned housing allowances, it's important to note that the investment would result in serving up to 93 individuals or households over 4 years. We're also looking for that continued support of permanent housing placements retention in home case management in order to make sure that when we are housing individuals, they stay housed. We want to build on the strategic engagement and remain in talks with the province, health sector partners, and community agencies to explore further partnerships for development of permanent housing solutions that meet the needs of the individuals. And over time, we incrementally reduce our expanded emergency system, concurrently focusing on prevention and permanent housing solutions. As we've heard consistently through the pandemic, vaccinations play a fundamental part in the fight against the pandemic and our ability for the system to transition away from emergency response. In collaboration with our tremendously hardworking folks in public health, vaccine distribution has prioritized individuals experiencing homelessness to receive first doses and worked hard to bring the vaccine to the places where they were, including the first round of clinics that were major congregate settings in our homelessness sector. Hamilton Housing Services, Public Health Services, and supported by the EOC, we've moved rapidly to organize and implement vaccine clinics from the early days of vaccine supply and continue to demonstrate flexibility in planning and implementation to vaccinate everyone within the homelessness system who wants to be vaccinated. Support from our shelter providers, community agencies, and shelter health were integral in supporting these clinics and helped ensure vaccine hesitancy was meaningfully addressed in order to result in high numbers of individuals being vaccinated. And as the slide indicates, through those first 24 dose clinics between February and May 2021 of this year, approximately 450 individuals experiencing homelessness received a vaccination. And obviously the next focus now is the second dose clinics planned for June of this year. With respect to the financial implications, these are still high estimates and projections based on higher usage periods during COVID-19. But as you can see, the proposed interventions that are known currently indicate a significant levy pressure. However, this would only be in the situation where receiving no further provincial or federal support for the ongoing actions in response to the pandemic. As such, staff will continue to advocate at all levels of government for the need and effectiveness of these financial supports to continue. And finally, I want to finish the presentation with the following graphic that most accurately and succinctly demonstrates the situation and response. Moving forward from this shift outlined in the slide was the basis for our 2019 CFA approved by Council, as well as our Homelessness Serving Systems Planning Framework. And this continues to be the system we want to transition back to COVID-19. We've had to necessarily enhance overall emergency response during this time, but we hope that through the adaptation of services, we can transition to a more responsive, resilient, sustainable, and housing-focused homeless serving system. That concludes my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Doctor. Now I'm promoting you to a doctor. Director John.
You made my mom very proud.
If only it was up to me, I would make myself one too and make my family all proud too to be the first NAN doctor in North America. So be it. Director John, thank you so much for the presentation, and also extending my thanks to staff and the partners for bringing the pandemic emergency responses and solutions that we've had in place over the past year, as well as those that are presented forward in your presentation. So at this time, turning to my colleagues to see if there's any questions on the presentation. We have Councillor Jackson.
Thank you, Chair Nan. And again, my applause, Director John, and to your managers who you have here authoring this report, Mastriani, Zelsko, and Tedesco. Please give my commendation and appreciation to your wonderful team. Just a few questions exploring what seems to be such an encouraging progression here for for looking after the homeless in our community, Edward, in such a compassionate way. Going right to the numbers, the budget. So am I to understand on page 6 of your report, Director, there's going to be an $11 million pressure for 2021, and if that is the case, don't we have about a $50 million surplus heading into 2021 for COVID-related matters, if I recall, from the General Manager of Finance, or am I mixing things in a different manner? Through you, Chair Nan, please.
So through the chair, I can confirm to the council, and I know we do have financial wizard on call too, as well as Paul to fill in any gaps. But that essentially we did, through the Municipal Safe Restart Fund, allocate funds through the 2021 process. Approximately $4.5 million were directed from that fund to assist. This is in addition to that funding. So that $50 million part, which is the Safe Restart, we'd already allocated to 2021 that amount, but would continue to look for other options in order to reduce that impact on the levy.
Can I understand, Edward, though? Oh, yeah, go ahead, General Manager Johnson. My apologies.
And through the chair, just to recognize that there would be reserve resources that council has already put aside to cover the 11 million over this period should we receive no additional support. So important to highlight that this is a pressure. It is unfunded by the province or the federal government. But to the other point, there does exist, although we don't have, we would need your direction to do so. There does exist resources within this organization that could cover it. However, there are other pressures that would need to be aligned to that. To suggest this is a pressure without a solution, no, there is a solution in place, but this is just one draw on that overall fund that's in place. So we do really hope that the province and the federal government continue to support these efforts so that we don't have to use that reserve which we did set up. But the comfort for you that we believe there are resources available should the worst case scenario be there is no additional support from province or federal funds, we would be able to handle this through those reserves that you set up last year to take care of this.
Thanks, General Manager Johnson. So that's guardedly reassuring. Money's available in different pots, but again, there might be reasons that other programs or services may want to tap in as well, but money is available. Okay, thank you. And Director John, did I hear you say, well, I would say optimistically, some of the community would say not fast enough. Did I hear you say in opening remarks about eliminating homelessness by 2025? To me, very optimistic, but again, others in the community may say, Councillor Jackson, not fast enough, should have happened yesterday. Can you elaborate upon that, please, Director?
Absolutely, and through the chair to the councillor. So through our 2019 call for applications, we did very precise funding expectations and target assessment in order to do just that, to eliminate chronic homelessness by 2025, in line with provincial and federal expectations. What we know is that when we house individuals, we have to support those individuals, and much of that funding was working on how we support those individuals in those stable housing placements to make them permanent, to avoid recidivism, so those individuals dropping back out of homelessness, back into our shelter system. And so those were the considered measures we put forward and had our community buy-in to achieve. Unfortunately, as we're all aware, and we've heard this story too often, is that COVID-19 came along and really interrupted the great success that we were starting to see at the beginning of the process.
Okay, all right, thank you for explaining that. A couple more questions, Chair Nan. Edward, in a utopia world, looking at your very last slide there, the emphasis you put on prevention and housing versus emergency shelters, the ideal is that we never ever again would need a shelter, or will there always be a place for shelters from a temporary standpoint? Through you, Chair Nan.
Through the chair to the councillor, we would always effectively need some form of emergency shelter. It's the term of the capacity that's the most important piece to that. So certainly, in a post-pandemic situation where we do have a healthy system with flow through and diversion operating at its most effective way, the amount of spaces we allow for emergency sheltering would reduce. We'd actually have individuals who don't go into housing and then drop back into homelessness. They stay in housing, and so that amount through that flow through would be needed, but at a far less amount. So that's the ideal situation, is when you reduce the amount of emergency shelters, which is typically the stay. Yep.
Last question, Chair Nan, if I'm still okay?
Yep, you still have a solid minute over. Or left.
Boy, I like the adjective solid minute. Okay. Director John, quickly, with the homeless, do you find that as we are trying to do our best to target those most in need, the marginalized from racial backgrounds, Indigenous, have you found that when you are providing housing, that they like to maintain some form of group setting, some form of clustering as an ethno-cultural racial group? Let me give you a quick example, and then you could respond. About 20 years ago, real fast, on the same type of committee with Macassa Lodge, there was a group of about 20 families from the Canadian Japanese cultural community of our city, and they were all at a point where the relatives were getting to the frail elderly standpoint. They were admitted to Macassa Lodge. The request was, because the community was so small, to maintain that continuity, that support system within that small group from the Canadian Japanese community, and we were able to accommodate them on one wing of Macassa Lodge. If you get my drift, is that type of thing happening out in our community, Chair Nan?
Through the chair to the councillor, so certainly we recognize there's not a one-size-fits-all approach to how we create those permanent housing solutions. And I know research locally does confirm, issues with women and how we respond differently. We know from our Indigenous partners that they're expecting a different response. So we do look upon what we can do flexibly to achieve those individualized needs, and obviously overcome some of those systemic pressures that is so very apparent. And I go back to the overrepresentation of Indigenous individuals in our system. So we absolutely do want to work with our partners as best we can to apply the resources that gives them the autonomy and the ability to approach this in the most meaningful way. And I go back to it. We recognize we'll always need emergency shelters, but we really want to make sure it's temporary and non-recurring, and that when we do create those housing placements, they're supported to the point that the individual stabilized and stays permanently housed, and we'll look and explore any opportunities for that effect to happen.
Director John, you have my full support for this report, and very compassionate work, starting with you as the leader of this team. Thanks, Chair Nan.
Thank you, Councillor Jackson, with 12 seconds left. Next on the list is Councillor Pauls, followed by Councillor Clark. I did have myself on as a first-time speaker. I had just given opening comments thanking Director John for his presentation. And then Councillor Collins has joined us as well from Council. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Director John Edward. I was wondering, you mentioned that in 2020 to 2021, we housed 319, which would be 741 people. Is that first-time housing or rehousing? And what kind of support did you give to that? Was it just first-time housing?
Through the chair to the councillor, while I don't have the exact breakdown, I would assume that a number of those individuals may have been housed in the past. One of the greatest challenges we have is this recidivism rate, which is those individuals who, are able to be provided shelter permanently, but fall out of that for a number of reasons, whether it's insufficient health supports, whether it's programming that's not wrap around sufficiently enough for the individuals, as well as a multitude of reasons. It is one of those continued resource questions that we pose to ourselves. But certainly through the program and through the results that we have and the expectations through our most recent call for applications, is that we do provide those supports. We do actually give the housing placement the greatest chance of continuing without that recidivism rate coming back and without having to deal with those individuals. And that's really when we talk about ending chronic homelessness. That's what, that's the group of individuals we're really trying to deal with. But obviously it's the most challenging because often they have a number of additional needs and supports when we do house those individuals.
What percentage usually you have to rehouse after you find them a place where it's suitable with support? What percentage of the people would have to be rehoused again? Do you have roughly?
Through the councillor through the chair to the councillor, we may be able to bring that rate. I don't have it on top of my head, but I know with my managers on the call today, if it does come up, I'll be happy to share that either through the chat or
Be
raise
interesting
it through
to
the chair.
know how we, first give them the first housing and the reasons why we have to rehouse them again. I'm just interesting to know the reasons as well. So, yeah, I would like to know that. That would be interesting. So, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Pauls. Councillor Clark.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I think it's a noble goal to try to eliminate homelessness. Are we indicating that we will be eliminating homelessness by 2025 or 2028? I forget the year, Mr. Edward.
Through the chair to the councillor, so 2019, in response to the CFA and best practice, the anticipation was that, and it's a challenge, that we would end chronic homelessness by 2025. Now with the pandemic and the need to transition from some of those emergency supports, we're constantly reevaluating whether that is still a possibility. It was always going to be a fairly high challenge. But just to recall, it's chronic homelessness that is ended in 2025, not homelessness writ large. So those are those individuals who continue to struggle when they are housed and have that fallout of housing approach to them.
And so how do we define chronic homelessness then?
That's a great question. So through the chair to the councillor, essentially, chronic is where those individuals have limited housing placements and duration within those housing placements. They either struggle to access them, or when they do access them, they fall out. In terms of an actual definition, homelessness, 6 months or more is typically the experience that the individual has to be deemed chronic homeless.
And my few discussions that I have had with about, I'd say, a dozen homelessness folks when they were coming to pick up their sandwiches and soup down on Ferguson Avenue there, and I was there, many of them indicated they did not want to go to shelters and they did not want the city's help, that they felt comfortable being on the street. I have challenges about that being healthy and safe for those residents. So is it really feasible that we could say we are going to eliminate chronic homelessness when some of the chronic homeless simply don't want to go to those shelters and don't want to, they in essence don't want the city's help? Some were a little bit more crass in their commentary to me, but they felt comfortable looking after themselves on the street. I don't agree, but I'm trying to understand how we can make a commitment that we're going to eliminate chronic homelessness when it is incredibly challenging.
Through the chair to the councillor, yes, and adopted a housing first approach. So it's, we will work with the individuals where they are through engagement. It does not necessarily mean, they have to stay within the shelter to get housed. We do consider that to be the most appropriate way to stabilize an individual and provide the supports. But from a housing first perspective, what our ultimate goal is to create those permanent, low barrier supportive housing models that can accommodate individuals, whether they are unsheltered, whether they're in the shelter system, but to meet them where they are and provide that wraparound support so that whatever form of housing is most appropriate for them is also sustained.
And my last question, if I may, Madam Chair, is this a cross-sectorial approach to eliminating homelessness? Let me back up for just a second. What I have seen is that the supports that are needed for supportive housing for folks who are mentally ill, chronically homeless, have substance abuse issues, the supports are not available, and so we may house them, but without those supports, the likelihood of them going back on the street is high if we don't have those supports. So are we getting that type of assistance from other agencies to provide the supports necessary to help these folks stay in permanent housing and stay safe and healthy?
Through the chair to the councillor, certainly in our existing intensive case management and housing support programs, we know we can deal effectively with individuals, with ranging acuity, but you picked up on that point where there are some individuals whose acuity make it incredibly difficult and unsustainable to use just housing supportive programs in order for them to be sustainable in those locations. At those points and those interventions, what we need is partnership, is support from our health partners in order to make sure that we deal with those concurrent disorders that are challenging the housing placements, which, as you mentioned, could range mental health, addictions, and often concurrent disorders that limit that. So we continue to explore that, and I think the report mentions one of the most innovative things through the pandemic that we've been able to achieve is some housing placements for those most acute, living unsheltered, with assistance from our health partners, and we continue to monitor that. I am the eternal optimist, but it does come with significant costs and considerable partnerships. And what we've always struggled with is kind of the siloed effect of housing and health when it comes to dealing with those individuals most acute. We need significant interrelated partnerships in order for it to succeed. And so we'll continue to advocate for that. We do need more assistance, but we've got the right infrastructure for it to be successful. We just need the partners and the money to come, and we will be able to deliver something that can deal with that gap that we see today.
It sounds like a good starting place, and I'm fully supportive of what is being proposed here. Don't get me wrong, but I think we all recognize how challenging it is. And ideally, we'd like the program to succeed, which means we need those supports from other agencies to help us with the folks who are having these tremendous challenges. So thank you very much for all of your work and all of the staff's work, actually. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Clark. At this time, I'd like to turn the chair over to Councillor Jackson.
Chair Nan, I've got my wristwatch. I'll do my best.
Thank you. Just on the topic through you, Vice Chair, on the topic of chronic homelessness, it was just recently reported that Medicine Hat is the first Canadian municipality to declare itself as having ended chronic homelessness. It came out today, or this week, I apologize, and was also the subject of a Federation of Canadian Municipalities workshop where the definition that they were working with is a functional zero definition, that no more than 3 people are experiencing chronic homelessness in a community for more than 3 months straight, and that the federal government, in making its declaration that they are working towards ending chronic homelessness, that one of the mechanisms that was identified in the FCM conference was an integrated system in the city where anyone accessing one service gets added to a central list and gets the supports and the housing that they need. So I know those efforts are underway with our staff, but on the presentation I did have a couple of specific questions, if I could, through you. On the first recommendation, Director John, it's extending the 378 Main Street East former Cathedral Boys School temporary men's shelter from what was supposed to be end of June was the original target date this year to no later than December. And my first question is, what needs to be in place in order to transition this facility to close?
Director?
Through the chair to the councillor, and thank you for the question. As it pertains to Cathedral Boys School, I think we recognized that the decision to extend it to the end of the year was to provide some flexibility. As you can imagine, we continue to try to respond effectively to this pandemic, and somehow it always manages to catch us, with significant implications. So in terms of what it would take, and I would mention that these are end dates, nothing is preventing us from decommissioning Cathedral sooner. It all depends really on what you asked, is what are those circumstances that would allow us to do it? And it's a collection of circumstances. We are trying to reduce our dependency on all of our surge shelter capacities. So we would first look to ensure all of our existing pre-COVID capacities within our existing shelter systems are back up and running to their full maximum, which is a continued discussion with public health. We would look, in order to do that, have a reduction in cases and outbreaks. So throughout the pandemic, obviously the outbreaks at individual shelters has really limited our ability to maximize occupancy in certain circumstances. So one shelter may only be 75% occupied, but there's an outbreak and so no new admissions. So we're challenged with having that flexibility in the system. So once we have a reduction through vaccinations, we're hopeful then that those outbreaks and those situations where we're not able to fully maximize capacities are now available. So that would once again help. And then obviously we're looking at some of those other transitional elements that will come into play, which could include looking at a temporary men's shelter just to help us through the transition, but that would be through a community engagement process, so open to the full community.
Thank you. And through you, Vice Chair, so there is a possibility, and the possibility being that the circumstances of reduced cases, outbreaks, getting us back into pre-pandemic occupancy capacity, making sure that folks are receiving their full vaccination doses, and those other transitional elements. If all of that is to occur in, let's say, an accelerated form, everything aligns, there is a possibility that this would close by December 31st, or is there any possibility that this could wrap up sooner?
Director?
Through the chair to the councillor, we're hopeful that it will be able to decommission sooner. Like I say, we remain in hope, but we are seeing, far impressive and optimistic numbers when it comes to our vaccination rates, when we come to looking at what's happening in terms of outbreaks and responses, as well as the overall patterns that we've emerged from our data system. So we are hopeful, certainly by the end date, but potentially before then.
Okay, thank you. And through you, Vice Chair, Director John, you know that my office has been fielding many calls and emails related to safety issues, hygiene issues, security issues since the temporary shelter began operations at the former Cathedral Boys School. And we had the opportunity to host a virtual meeting between city staff as well as the operator to address the community's concerns. Since then, they have requested that should anything change, that they be afforded the same opportunity to ask their questions, get the information in the same way that we are right now, have an opportunity for informal dialogue to get all of their questions answered. Is that a possibility, and when do you think is the soonest that kind of meeting could be arranged, given the initial announcement was for it to end on June 30th, and now we're looking at an extension to hopefully sooner then, but potentially at the latest December 31st.
Director?
Through the chair to the councillor, I know we initiated the process with some community engagement. I know it was virtual, and we had a good discussion with the operator as well. We'd be happy to, once again, at the direction of your office, organize and be in attendance at such a meeting and provide that information. And one small point I failed to mention in my previous response, which is probably the most meaningful ability for us to no longer depend on our increased capacity, is that focus on outflow. And that's really the key solution to all of this is ensuring that our outflow, both diversion and outflow, are able to then reignite this process where we have less dependency and less demand on the capacity.
Thank you. Through you, Vice Chair, then I think it'll be essential that we do work together to make sure that communication outreach happens in paper form to every mailbox in the adjacent neighborhood. The community engagement piece, especially now after having such a long time of enduring some of these issues, that we're able to facilitate as many people getting the information as possible, is going to be essential. The last question I had was in relation to the recommendation regarding the temporary increases to women's emergency shelter system capacities. So recognizing the goal of the report and everything you outlined, the expanding shelter and housing supports for women, trans, and non-binary folks subcommittee had recommended and was ratified by council to direct staff to support the Native Women's Center Mountain View location that is in jeopardy of losing funding for their current 15 beds. Where does that work fit in the context of this report? and or subsequent reports to come.
Director?
Through the chair to the councillor, yes, I think you picked upon it, that this report really focused on reducing that dependency on the hotels and the surge shelters and the interventions most appropriate for that. We recognize that there was a motion made through the subcommittee and adopted by council, which will report back separately. We do anticipate, this is the third iteration of the report, that we continue to build this robust response. Giving all the support and necessary push for the outflow and the system as general to deal with that. So we will be looking at that and bringing that before you separately.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Could I just ask, Director, on behalf of the councillor, any ideas to time frame before the end of this year, the next few months, Director? Any indication, any range for the councillor?
So through the chair to the council, we have been engaged with both the operator as well as CHIL. This is an Indigenous entity which is providing us some insight in terms of the funding. We know the funding piece is going to be at issue shortly, I think within the next few months, so it will be a short turnaround for this report.
Okay. Councillor Nan?
Thank you. I'll take back the chair, and we have Councillor Collins with us. Thank you, Vice Chair Jackson.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Terrific. Thank you. Through you to Dr. John. A couple of quick questions. I think it's very important that we support the recommendations that are in front of us. And I really like the questions that I heard around the status of homelessness and where we see that trend going, chronic homelessness over the next couple of years. And I really don't see an end in sight, unfortunately, even as Edward mentioned earlier, with all the good work that we've done. With our proximity to other large urban centers like Brantford and Niagara, and our proximity, of course, now being almost a part of the GTA, it's just a sheer number of people that it's a problem that just doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon, and that's a very difficult issue to tackle when the provincial government isn't part of the solution. We've certainly received supports from the feds on that issue, but the province, notwithstanding COVID supportive funding that helps us on a temporary basis, we need consistent provincial support to create not just the programs, but the wraparound services that Edward offered as well. So I think it's absolutely necessary that we continue to support recommendations like the ones that Edward and his staff have in front of us here today. I do have a question about the length of stay issue versus the increase in numbers that Edward had mentioned through his presentation. And I just want to be clear that we do not see currently an increase in the total population locally, but I think, Edward, you suggested that their length of stay in the shelter system it has been prolonged as a result of service interruptions with COVID and the broader pandemic.
Director John?
Through the chair to the councillor, that's an entirely accurate kind of overview of the position. It is essentially the biggest driver for the situation that we're finding right now is the length of stay, and that's primarily a response of the fact that there has been inabilities and challenges with both diversion, so those individuals accessing the system, and most notably outflow, which is those people leaving the system.
Thank you. And I accidentally raised the report yesterday at committee, not knowing that, or forgetting, sorry, that this was coming to committee today. And so I had asked General Manager Johnson about the total number of homelessness population who've been vaccinated with their first shot. And I think the range, and you reiterated it today, and it's 400. And I was asking for a percentage of the population that has been vaccinated. And so I don't know today if you have our total number of men who are deemed homeless at this point in time, women who might be included in, obviously, in that number, and then the trans and non-binary population. Do you have those figures right now? And I'll contextually tell you why I'm asking them, because I'm in the same situation that Councillor Nan is in right now as it relates to the hotel setting. Her cathedral facility is a bit different, but it is a temporary shelter, and the hotel setting on Centennial for me is certainly a temporary situation as well. I think we have 4 or 5 floors of our homeless population in that one hotel, and so I think that the questions that I ask are about how soon can we reintegrate the population back into the traditional supportive facilities that we have across the city, and primarily in the downtown, close to other services that the homeless population rely on, whether it's substance abuse issues, where they're receiving addictions treatment, whether it's basic medical supports that they receive, and or other counseling that they might receive for whatever challenges that they face in their life. So, being in the East End, adjacent to the QEW on Centennial Parkway, is a long ways away from that traditional support network and the traditional service providers who help them with those problems. And I asked the question about vaccinations because I've heard anecdotally there's a bit of a vaccine hesitancy. And so if we continue to see low take-up rates, and maybe low is not the right word, but if we continue to see outbreaks because we're not getting through the population with the vaccine, we're going to continue to be in a situation where we have to rely on the temporary facilities like Councillor Nain has in her area, as well as the hotels, basically outside of the almost urban area, and it's just, it was temporary, and it's just, I don't think it's good for the population in terms of being away from their support. So sorry for the preamble there, but I think it was contextually important for me to let you know why I've asked that question.
Thank you, Councillor Collins. That brings you to, you have a minute left, but go ahead.
Thank you. So do you have do you have the numbers as it relates to vaccination rates, and do you have the total population, homeless population numbers that might assist us in understanding how close we are to getting back to the traditional settings that we were accustomed to prior to the pandemic?
So through the chair to the council, and I'm glad you contextualized that, and it absolutely captures some of those challenges that we're facing right now in terms of working with our public health partners as to how we move forward when we get those rates of vaccinations up and what the system looks like in response to that. And there's many permutations, both in terms of isolation space, but also in terms of getting individuals back to those support networks that exist. And I know it's been less than an ideal response with regard to some of the surge capacity that we've created, both geographically as well as some other circumstances. So we recognize that continues to be a challenge. And when it comes to the actual breakdown per population, we don't have that available, but I can certainly try and work with public health to determine, provided there's no confidentiality issue, about just general between the populations, what that looks like. We have had increasingly better luck with the vaccination clinics. When we first began, as you can imagine, this is one of the first populations to receive it. So not only is it a challenging population with regards to how we provide information, but it was also one of the first populations outside those most vulnerable, including the homeless, to receive it. So we've actually worked quite well with our community partners, our agencies and shelter providers, to increase that uptake and reduce that pressure on the vaccine hesitancy. It still exists, as it will exist in the entire population, but we've worked fairly hard and comprehensively to deal with that. And we do have the optimism of returning it to those infrastructure pieces within short order following the vaccination uptake to do that. So I know it's not exactly all the information you asked, but I can certainly help with discussions with public health to deliver some of that to you offline.
I would appreciate receiving that. My last question, Madam Chairman, would be the whole issue surrounding what comes post-pandemic. And so, as we all know, for those of us who've followed affordable housing related issues and the wait list, and where we've been historically with some of those challenges after a downturn in the economy, which certainly the pandemic has thrust upon us. I'm curious to know, Edward, what we're doing to prepare for whatever wave of, whether it's homelessness, whether it's an additional crunch on the wait list in terms of, we almost witnessed a doubling after the 2008-2009 downturn in the economy. If we're poised to see something like that post-pandemic a year or two from now, we're in trouble because we're already in a crisis situation, and that's not unique to Hamilton. That's all municipalities across the country. But what are we doing to prepare for the possibility that, in fact, this issue isn't going to get better in the short and medium term, understanding we've had tremendous support from other levels of government, but if eventually those supports will run out, and I think we need some kind of some thought given to what happens in 2022, 2023, and 2024 if history repeats itself back to, again, the last downturn in the economy, 1990s prime example too, in terms of the recession that we experienced then and its impact on the housing continuum and all the issues as it relates to people being displaced from their current residences and finding themselves homeless. So I know that's a pretty loaded question, but if there's anything that you can provide as it relates to what we're thinking about now for next year and the year after, I'd appreciate knowing what it is.
Thank you, Councillor Collins, and that exhausts your time. Director John, please.
So through the chair to the councillor, and just wish to reiterate, yeah, absolutely, this report is really focused on reducing that dependency on those emergency measures. We're absolutely considering all of the other impacts that will affect those systems, and housing instability being one of those key determinants, particularly in an economic downturn, what that could happen with individuals who currently are housed. There may be issues finding, rent, other additional issues with finances, and so this committee has also approved a number of other meaningful interjections, and I think you're aware of the rent bank which was established. We continue to monitor those trends. We know that the rapid housing initiatives have offered the ability to create low rent brand new dwellings throughout the city, so we continue to advocate for more money through federal advocates to ensure those numbers keep increasing. And once again, this integrated approach. I don't wish for anyone to think that this report is therefore dictating that housing services is only keeping its eye on those emergency responses. We're very aware of the system as a whole and looking for those important interventions to ensure that stability is found throughout the system.
Thank you, Director John. So ongoing prep and planning fitting within the overall housing and homelessness strategy, so we can anticipate a plan or updates to the plan to address the points that Councillor Collins has mentioned. As ongoing iterations of the work?
Through the chair to the council, yes. So, this is, as I said, one of many iterations of information we're bringing to committee for that specific purpose.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Collins, for joining us this afternoon. Colleagues, any other questions on the presentation? Seeing none, may I have a mover and seconder to receive the presentation? Thank you again, Director John, and all the staff in the background, Councillor Pauls and Councillor Clark. It's electronic to receive the presentation.
Sorry about that, Madam Chair. The vote should be in front of you now.
Excellent, thank you.
And that was Pauls and Clark, I heard.
Correct.
All right, the vote is closed. And it's taking its time. It is carried unanimously.
Thank you. And since, colleagues, we've had an opportunity to dig in with the presentation, may I have a mover and seconder for the report that the presentation was in reference to? Moved by Councillor Jackson, seconded by Councillor Pauls. Thank you. So if there's no further discussion at 8.1 on the recommendation specifically, seeing none, we'll move to electronic vote. Should be up on the screen now.
And the vote is before you, yes.
Elsie Bates.
For Councillor Clark and Councillor Nan. Yes, I'm sorry.
Just so you know, the vote is showing up with the entirety of the recommendations within it, and it doesn't enable me to scroll down to the bottom of the vote portion, so I am in favor. Thank you.
Okay. And Councillor Clark, we're just waiting for you.
He's a thumbs up.
I've got a thumbs up. All right. So the vote is now closed, and it carries unanimously.
Thank you, colleagues. Moving on to discussion items. Item 10. Point 1 is the service manager's consent for City Housing Hamilton to sell Jamesville property. Report HSC 21021 in Ward 2. May I please have a mover and seconder to put the report on the floor? Moved by Councillor Clark, seconded by Councillor Jackson. Thank you. Any discussion on item 10.1? Seeing none, we'll then proceed to the electronic vote. And just a reminder that this is in reference to the James Street, Ferry Street, and McNabb Street and Strachan Street City Housing Hamilton properties and conversion into the new development there. Thank you.
And the vote is now closed. And it carries unanimously.
Thank you. Moving on to, are there any notices of motion, committee members? Seeing none, we'll move on to item 13, general information and other business. Are there any items of general information or other business committee members would like to raise? Seeing none, we'll move on to private and confidential. Item 14, members of the committee, do you wish to move into closed session to discuss items 14.1 to 14.2? Councilor Marula, is that you indicating that you'd like to speak? Perhaps. We can't hear you, Councilor Marula. He may be in a different meeting, folks. Or in a different discussion altogether. I don't think that he's hearing us right now, and I don't think that the visual of him speaking is for private and confidential. So if it's a no...
I'm happy to move it if we can. I'm not sure how we do it in open session, though.
Thank you. So if we're not, if there's no discussion, there's no need for us to go in camera, correct, Clerk?
That is correct. So then we would just go ahead and move the open session, or sorry,
Yep.
Yes, move on and vote the open recommendations in the report.
Thank you. So moved by Councillor Clark, seconded by Councillor Pauls, to have item 14.1 to approve the recommendations in item 14.1. Thank you.
Can someone just read that recommendation so the public knows what we're voting on?
Oh, thank you.
I can certainly do that for you. The recommendation is, bear with me for one moment. The recommendation is that that's not it. It is that the direction provided to staff in closed session respecting report HSC 21017, emergency shelter services team staffing be approved, and B, that the report remain confidential.
Thank you.
Thank
Duly
you.
moved and seconded. Thank you, Councillor Clark.
So I have the mover as Councillor Clark and the seconder
Councillor Pauls.
Pauls. Thank you.
Okay, so on to item 14.2, status change. Oh, my apologies.
Hold on, we're waiting
the
for
vote to
Councillor
close.
Jackson and Councillor Marula. Councillor Jackson, are you able to vote?
Just give us a Councillor Marula if you could indicate if you're
thumb
able
out.
to use. Okay,
He's
there
got
we
a thumbs out. There we go.
All right.
Oh. All right, so the vote is now closed. And it passes unanimously.
Thank you. And item 14.2, status change of housing programs officer position report HSC 21019. And may I please have a mover and seconder to approve the recommendations in this report. And they are, Clerk, if you could read them out. For open session, the script is not there.
Certainly. We have that the directions provided to staff in closed session respecting report HSC 21019, status change of the housing programs officer position, be approved, and B, that report HSC 21019 respecting status change of the housing programs officer position remain confidential.
Thank you for that. It is moved by Councillor Clark, seconded by Councillor Jackson. And the vote is before you electronically.
And now we're waiting for Councillor Marula to vote. And
there's a thumbs up on the visual record.
Okay, there, he's able to vote, yeah.
Excellent.
The vote is closed. And it carries unanimously.
Thank you. So we're moving on to adjournment. A mover and seconder to adjourn. Thank you. Councillor Pauls, seconded by Councillor Jackson. Require an electronic vote. And thank you, to staff and clerks for your support in this meeting today.
The vote should be before you now.
Thank you, Chair.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you all for being here and for the work of the committee.
And that carries unanimously.
Wonderful.
And that long and arduous meeting.
There you go. Just as
There you go.
requested.
As requested. Have a great day.
Take care.